1969, a year that still sits like a shadow over Newcastle city centre, and a year that changed the way this club, this city and this country looked at travelling football support. Newcastle hadn't lifted a trophy since '55. The Fairs Cup run was like a dream, a genuine spark in a decade that hadn't given the fans much to smile about. And when the semi-final draw threw up Glasgow Rangers, well, everyone in the North East knew exactly what kind of storm was heading their way. Rangers weren't just a big club, they were a force, a travelling support unlike anything England had ever seen at the time. Enormous numbers, enormous noise, and an enormous reputation. So when the first leg took Newcastle fans north of the border, thousands made the journey, buses from the Haymarket, trains rammed at Central Station, a proper 60s away day migration. The further they moved through Glasgow, the louder the atmosphere became. Not friendly, not welcoming. Everything was a look, a shout, a gesture. Inside Ibrox, the game itself was tight. Newcastle held on, the home side missed a penalty, and somehow the Magpies escaped with a 0-0 draw, a brilliant result on paper. But the streets didn't care about the scoreline. As the Geordies were marched back towards the buses, everything changed. The verbal abuse disappeared, replaced by a hailstorm of bricks, bottles, tins, anything the Rangers fans could get their hands on. Bill Gibbs, chairman of the Fairs Club, a fans group that meets to honour Newcastle's stars of the 60s and 70s, was one of around 10,000 fans who made the journey that day. The noise in the ground was deafening. We were in the away end and it was a terrifying experience. When McFall saved the penalty, the mood changed. We decided to leave 5 minutes before the end of the game, only to find some of our coaches had their windows smashed. Then when we finally pulled away, Rangers fans surrounded the bus, making cutthroat gestures, and some were even waving blades around. We were relieved to get out of Glasgow. Back in the northeast, supporters spent the next week buzzing about the result, but also talking quietly, almost nervously, about the atmosphere in Glasgow. Everyone knew the second leg at St James's Park was going to be wild. What they didn't know, at least not yet, was that the violence wouldn't stay inside the ground. It would spill into the streets, it would sweep through the city centre, and it would become one of the most infamous nights Newcastle had ever seen. This is the story of the night Rangers took over Tyneside. By the time the return leg rolled around, the whole of Newcastle was on edge. Everyone had heard the stories from Glasgow, and everyone knew one thing: Rangers would not be travelling quietly. From early morning, Central Station began to shake with noise, not from trains, but from the waves of Rangers fans pouring into the city, blue scarves hanging from coat pockets, tin trays of beer carried off the platforms, songs echoing through the station arches. For many Geordies who witnessed it, this was the biggest travelling support they had ever seen in their lives. Rangers fans filled the bars, the side streets, the taxis, the stairwells, the bus stops. They owned the city centre before most locals had even finished their breakfast. Police tried to form groups, but it was hopeless. You can't escort a tidal wave. As kickoff approached, the blue tide began to move. Imagine thousands of Ranger supporters walking shoulder to shoulder through the streets of Newcastle, not as a neat column, but as a single mass. Not many things intimidate a Geordie crowd, but this was something else entirely. Up near Bath Lane, the first serious pockets of disorder exploded. Rangers fans smashed windows, overturned bins, climbed onto cars, and charged at Newcastle supporters unlucky enough to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Police tried to wedge themselves between the groups, but again, the numbers were against them. By the time the supporters reached St James's Park, the surrounding streets were already littered with broken glass and furniture dragged out of pubs, and the match hadn't even started. If the build-up in the streets felt dangerous, the atmosphere inside the stadium was something else entirely. Nearly 60,000 people crammed into the old ground, one of the biggest crowds Newcastle had seen in years, and you could taste the emotion in the air. This was the semi-final of the Intercities Fairs Cup, a gateway to a European final, and two of the fiercest, proudest fan bases in Britain were about to go head-to-head. But the eye of the storm was the Gallowgate End, because that's where they put them. All 10,000 Rangers supporters. It wasn't segregation, it was containment. They were packed into the terrace shoulder to shoulder, a heaving, roaring mass of blue, bouncing from barrier to barrier, and some weren't content with ground level. They climbed the floodlight pylons, dozens of feet into the air, perched like birds of prey, waving bottles, cans, scarves, anything they could hold. Newcastle came out flying, and after just a few minutes, the breakthrough came. Jim Scott, Scottish winger, just to rub salt in the wounds, lashed the ball home, and the black and white end exploded. But if you turned your eyes to the other end, the Rangers fans were furious. Missiles started to fly, a few bottles here, a couple of cans there. Nothing major yet, but the simmer was turning into a boil. Police dogs were brought behind the goal, not for show, for protection. But with 13 minutes left, it happened. Jackie Sinclair, another Scot of course, swung his boot and buried the second goal. Game over. Newcastle were heading to the final. St James's went ballistic. Hundreds of Rangers supporters poured out of the terraces, a blue wave cascading over the crush barriers and onto the pitch. Those perched on the pylons hurled bottles. Others ripped up advertising boards. Some charged toward the police line, while others squared up to Newcastle fans trying to vault barriers of their own. It wasn't a pitch invasion, it was a riot. The air filled with glass, coins, metal, anything that could be launched. Police dogs lunged, truncheons swung, officers formed a barrier only to be knocked backward again and again by the sheer force of bodies. One police spokesman admitted afterward, "If we'd had enough men, we'd have arrested all 2,000 who came over the barriers." For 17 minutes, St James's Park looked like a battleground. The referee abandoned any attempt to restart the match. Players sprinted for the tunnel. Fans in the stands grabbed children and pulled them to safety. And around the edge of the pitch, a line of police officers with Alsatians stood shoulder to shoulder, staring down a sea of furious faces. By the time order was finally restored, 89 people were injured, 30 were arrested, and the Gallowgate was left looking like a bomb site. Newcastle had qualified for a European final, but nobody was talking about the football. It was a night that shocked the entire footballing world, and the violence inside the ground was only half the story. The real damage was done after the final whistle, when thousands of angry, humiliated, and half-cut Rangers fans spilled into the Newcastle night. If the Gallowgate had been a battleground, the city centre was about to become a war zone. The first casualties were the pubs. Places that had been heaving just an hour earlier were suddenly under siege, glasses flying out of doorways, windows smashed in with bare fists, tables and chairs dragged into the street. Some pubs were stripped bare within minutes. As the mob moved, the destruction followed. They swarmed Percy Street, chasing isolated Newcastle fans, shattering shop fronts, pulling down signs, ripping open doors. At Haymarket, shoppers and commuters were suddenly caught up in running fights. Cars stopped dead. Buses struggled to turn corners because of the crowds. Some Rangers fans even tried forcing their way into moving vehicles. When smaller pockets broke away from the main mob, that's where the local lads stepped in. There were sharp, nasty scraps all around the city, but this wasn't even. Not tonight. The sheer number of Rangers fans made retaliation dangerous, and Newcastle supporters couldn't risk being swallowed by the larger waves, so the resistance came in bursts, quick, targeted, and only when the odds weren't impossible. By 10 p.m, Newcastle looked like a different place. Shops shuttered, buses cancelled, streets cordoned off, police running from one incident to another, always 3 steps behind the next outbreak. The Chronicle would write the next day, "The city was glass-strewn and battered, counting the cost of a night of shame." The Magpies went on to win the Fairs Cup, lifting the trophy weeks later in Budapest. But the semi-final was a warning, one British football ignored for far too long. A glimpse of the storm that would define the 70s and 80s. A moment when the beautiful game showed its ugliest face. And yet, for better or worse, this is part of our history and we'll never forget it. If you enjoyed today's video, please remember to give it a like. It really helps the channel, and subscribe if you're new, you know it makes sense. Thanks for watching, I'll see you next time.